Hey folks, have you ever wondered how software leaders pushing the boundaries in today's environment are adopting emerging trends? At QCon San Francisco, November 18 to 22nd, you'll step inside the minds of engineers who will share how they implement innovations in real-world scenarios. Explore tracks like architectures you've always wondered about, engineering productivity, and generative AI in production and advancements, and learn from senior practicing software developers on how they're adopting emerging trends. Find out more about the conference at qconsf.com. We hope to see you there.
Welcome to the Architects Podcast, where we discuss what it means to be an architect and how architects actually do their job. Today's guest is Bernd Ruecker, who is the founder and chief technologist at Camunda, a company involved with process orchestration. It now has about 500 people, and your clients include banks, insurance companies, and telcos. Bernd has contributed to various open source workflow engines over the past 20 years and has written 3 books and is writing a 4th. And I've written 2 books, and I know how time-consuming book writing is. It's great to have you here on the podcast, and I'd like to start out by asking you, were you trained as an architect? How did you become an architect? Because it's not something you decided one morning, you woke up and said, today I'm going to be an architect.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Michael. No, it's probably not like that. For me, honestly, I have probably a very typical thing that I started to do things like programming with the computer super early on when I was like 13 or 14 or whatever. And then I think one of the key moments for me was really when a friend of mine during high school basically started his own business. He was selling kind of modded graphic cards. It's a very specific thing back then, but over the internet. And he had a lot of trouble because he got successful with that. And he had a lot of piles of everything. Piles of hardware lying there, piles of emails lying there, piles of invoices lying there, piles of stuff lying everywhere. And basically asked me if I can help him. And I started to, naive as I was, I basically, from the perspective I have now, I would say I started to write an ERP system for that. And that was really by accident. And I dived into that. And that was kind of coexisting with, let's say, my interest about kind of software architecture in a way. I tried to get books around that. I tried to understand how to structure a system. And I could try that out. And I got into enterprise Java beans back then. I got into how to structure like different components, how to build them, that I can run them. And I wrote a system that is really weird, still up and running today to some extent. And that taught me a lot of things about architecture, and also taught me that I find it more interesting to understand that kind of bigger picture around that system instead of diving into one thing very, very deep. And I think that was kind of the roots of it. And I did study computer science. I did a master degree for software engineering. So I really focused on that in my university as well. But I got started, I would say, even earlier than that.
So in other words, it was sort of a accidental discovery of necessity that got you into architecture.
Probably, yes. Yeah.
In other words, the mess it is, and you figured out, how I'm going to organize this mess that I'm in. And that led you to sort of architecture. And then you mentioned that you were working on essentially an ERP system. Was that sort of what got you thinking about orchestration?
Oh, yeah, 100%. So, part of what the system has to do is basically looking at data at rest, kind of what orders do I have, what hardware do I have lying around and stuff. But at the same time, you also have to look at the processes. And that's where we started, like the workflows, like the order fulfillment, like the returns good handling. These were basically the problems where we started. Like, how can we manage that process that it runs efficiently? And also back then, I started to look into that. I found it fascinating. And probably we can discuss that later on as well. But I'm a big fan of visuals. I also was always a big fan of UML class diagrams, for example, for structuring. And I looked into visuals for workflows. And back then, that was not yet very well developed, I would say. There were a couple of weird things happening. There was Beeple.
I remember Beeple.
Okay, yeah. Hopefully a lot of people forgot about that. But there was not really a good solution for these kind of workflows. And that got me hooked into the whole question, but there should be. And even back then, there were 2 options I found. The one was going with super expensive enterprise software on a really complex tech stack. which was obviously not an option for that at all. And I looked at open source projects, and there were not many back then, and they were super technical. But I looked into one, I got a contributor there, and I worked with that actually to implement the workflow within that system. Basically order fulfillment and returns good handling. And that got me into the whole process orchestration thing. First of all, thinking about it, also in the community. Then I started giving a talk about that. That brought me into freelancing around workflow engines. And in a way, that's also the story. I co-founded a company that does process orchestration as a product. I stumbled into that as well, if you will.
Well, look, life, sometimes, some people know where they're going from day one, and some people are like, just stumble their way to success. But you said two things that were kind of interesting, and I want to sort of focus in on them. You mentioned process orchestration, and process orchestration is a type of distributed system. And distributed systems are becoming increasingly common in our world. We see them all over the place, but people still really do not understand when people are involved in the distributed system. And process orchestration is all about that. And why do you think people have so much trouble dealing with process orchestration?
It's a very good question, to be honest.
And you might want to define, just for our listeners who are not familiar with this, you might want to also define what process orchestration is.
Probably that's a good first step. So process orchestration is basically getting order in certain steps you have to do. So you orchestrate those steps, you coordinate those steps. That's kind of the wording behind that. And normally then you have technology, then can do that. And the way it works is you define models. Nowadays it's BPMN. I'm a big fan of BPMN, business process model and notation. It's a graphical model you define where you say, I have those, for example, 3 steps I have to do in a sequence. So I do the first step first. When that's done, the next step is happening. And then you can run such a workflow engine or process orchestrator that can interpret those models and can run instances of that, like the orders I talked about. And then they run through basically all those steps. And then the workflow engine makes sure that if there are decisions on the way, if there are complex patterns, like if you're waiting for too long, you should do something else or push something to a human and whatever. So that's the one thing. Process orchestrators can interpret those models so you get a visual. And the second big thing is it's also about long-running processes. So the process orchestrator can wait for things to happen. That's very often a human, but it might also be an asynchronous answer from a system that takes longer, or a response from a customer. So there are a lot of things where you might need to wait. And that's what a process orchestrator can do. And then it's normally like persisted. And you have all the tooling around that where you can see what's currently happening, where are you waiting, and so on and so forth.
So what do people find so difficult about this?
That's the question that also puzzles me for a decade now, I think. I think that there are a couple of perceptions around that. It's a lot about perception, I think, because I started with visual models, for example. If you ask developers about visual models, very often you get a negative feeling around that. That's true for UML, class diagrams. I never understood that. That's also true for process models. And I make the case with UML first, because that's probably what most people out there know. And a lot of people probably learned that in university, and it's a drawing. It's like dead paper. Or you even had model-driven architecture quite a while back, where you tried to generate software out of these models, which never worked very well. But I also recall when I started, there was a tool which was actually super great, that where you wrote Java code, and then you could just look at the code you wrote as an UML diagram, because it knows if I have a collection typed of that type, I can just make 2 boxes in the right arrow. So it was kind of a automatically documenting things. It was live documentation, and it worked the other way around as well. You could add attributes there and was adding that to the code. And that I found that so helpful to get an overview of what I was doing. And the same is true for these process models. They're so helpful at their executable code. So they're not a wishful thinking document. They're executable code, but they're readable by every human. And that does not actually have to be a computer scientist. It can be a business person as well. It can be whatever. And that's so valuable, but somehow developers are scared of these process models. That's the first perception I see everywhere.
I mean, some of that is sort of historical. After all, the original idea behind COBOL was that even a manager could program. I don't know if you remember COBOL, but that was one of the first computer languages developed. And of course, that was an utter failure. From that point of view, I mean, COBOL is used all over the place, but from the idea of that would be obvious. I think some of the fear programmers have, and I remember from when I used some of those visual display tools, is sort of the paradox of programming. You know, normal engineers or civil engineer can essentially spend their entire career conceptually building the same bridge over and over again. But in software, if we want to build something new, we reprogram it all from scratch. Because if you want another copy of Microsoft Word, you just copy the bits and you're done. You only undertake a programming project if there's something new to do. But the technology that we've automated is based on what we knew in the past. So there's a disconnect between what we could automate in the past, but the fact that we're doing something new that we never did before, and that the tools are not capable of doing that. And that's the frustration I had when I used some of those visual modeling tools.
Yeah, but I would look at it from a different lens. For me, it's really a little bit of a different view on the same thing. I mean, you can write code in whatever Java, Node, or C#. It's also an abstraction. You don't write it on whatever assembler level anymore, right? And the same is for BPMN, for example. It's a language that's defined exactly how it should behave, and then you express problems with that language on a different abstraction level. But it's still general purpose. You can model whatever you want to model there. And the other thing people forget then very often is you're not, especially if you could use good tooling, that's probably, again, something a lot of vendors did pretty bad in the past. But if that's flexible enough or developer friendly enough, you can always say, there's an SPI, there's a hook where I can hook in code if I don't get any further with BPMN. Then I simply just code it. But there are certain elements in BPMN which are great for expressing long-running problems. And I simply should use them because that's what I see on a weekly basis at least. Otherwise, people start implementing their own homegrown bespoke workflow engines without knowing it. It's, we just need that order status column in that table over there. Oh, but we have to monitor that. We write a small scheduler looking at that every day, and then we do this and that. And they start to build workflow engines. I see that so often. And it always starts with, we don't want to have the complexity of an additional component. Yeah, but no, you have the complexity of that mess you wrote. So.
Plus, you're rethinking something from scratch and not getting the benefit of other people's experience. So that raised something also interesting that makes me think about the low-code movement. So in other words, when you use a system such as this, you're trying to minimize the amount of code that a developer has to write, which is generally a good thing. So, however, when you're trying to figure out why the system is not working, do these orchestration engines or whatever you want to call them get in the way of understanding what's happening? Or are they too much of a black box?
Let's say the core engine itself should be a black box. I mean, even if you have the source available and you could look into that, nobody wants to do that. I mean, I recall times when I debugged into Hibernate as an ORM mapper. That's nothing you ever want to do just because you can.
Yes, I've done that. Yes.
So I would say overall that should be a black box, and that's good as it is. But it's, again, very general purpose. So if you have a good product there, the core should work. And it's not, I mean, it's still complex to get that right, especially at scale, for example. But what it does from looking at it from the outside is not that complicated. So it basically triggers certain activities, and that's either a connector, which is code, or it's your code. So it's normally not that big of a problem. So you still have the possibility to debug into things, for example, that you just don't debug into the core engine. You debug into what you made out of that, basically the activities you put into the process. You have the possibility to write automated unit tests, for example. So that's not gone because you use such an orchestrator.
I guess what you're sort of saying is that, you know, we write stuff on top of the operating system and we don't step into the operating system.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, you're right.
And there are bugs in the operating system, but I guess what you're saying is we look at them sort of as the system is supposed to do X, it doesn't do X. We have to call up the vendor and understand why that is the case.
And I mean, overall, It's a bit like also the cloud discussion. Oh, we can't put that in the cloud. Is that secure? I'm 100% sure it's more secure than what most companies do at home.
Yes, yes, yes. The only interesting thing about the cloud, just as a side issue, as you mentioned it, it just builds a more tempting target for someone to hack.
Probably, yes, yeah.
Yeah, Willie Sutton was a very famous bank robber, and he asked why he robbed banks, and he said, well, that's where the money is.
That true, it makes sense. But at the same time, if you compare using a product for that's built for that and
obvious, yes, yes, yes.
And used in a lot of organizations, it's probably better than just code it yourself. Yeah.
Yes, yes. But again, when you're dealing with human fear.
Yeah. But honestly, the typical objections are not about, ooh, is my software still stable? It's very often about, I don't need that component. It's still that belief because it's so simple. My problem is so simple. It's not. And probably because people are not really looking into, let's say, the full scope of process orchestration, like on an enterprise level. That's a different topic we should probably look into. And the one thing, and that kept me actually busy for a couple of years, discussing orchestration versus choreography, basically. The whole thing, do I want to control what's happening or do I want to let it evolve by pushing events around, for example? And there was a belief for quite a while, I think it changes at the moment, but there was a belief that event-driven is so much easier to do. It's so much more decoupled. It's better, or probably more beautiful or more modern or whatever you want to call it, architecture. And that led a lot of projects into, we don't need orchestration. Orchestration is kind of bad. They brought that together with, centralized bottlenecks and whatever. And that's 100% not true. And that's another perception we saw out there where people deliberately didn't want to go into the orchestration route, especially out of IT, which is kind of weird.
Yeah, it is. But you're not arguing against event-driven architectures altogether.
No. So my point is there is a place for event-driven and there's a place for orchestration. Basically, both are typically about different components or services communicating. There we're back to the distributed system. Because in my order fulfillment process, I need to talk to the CRM system, to the ERP system, to the stock, to the logistics system. So I need to get all those pieces together. So the question is how do those components interoperate? And with orchestration, basically, I have one component that has the duty, the responsibility of orchestrating the end-to-end process and saying, okay, the first thing I have to do is, for example, getting the stuff from stock or retrieving the payment and so on and so forth. It can control that to some extent. With event-driven, with the choreography, you basically distribute that responsibility, saying there's an event, the order just came in and then some component knows, okay, then I have to collect money. And that's an architecture question, actually. One of the core architecture questions, how do you want to distribute responsibilities amongst the components? And that's a design choice you can make. And there are sometimes good arguments where you want to be event-driven, and there are sometimes good arguments where you want to be orchestrated. And especially if I look at these typical business processes, like order fulfillment or in whatever, I want to get a new bank account, I want to get a claim settled, or all these kind of business processes, then you very often, from a business perspective, you want to have somebody responsible for the end-to-end, because the customer is only happy if the parcel arrives at my door. It doesn't look at how beautiful my events are flowing within. Just if I get my stuff here, or if I get my money paid out or whatever, then the customer is happy. So there's a big emphasis on the end-to-end and understanding certain KPIs and bottlenecks and everything on the end-to-end level. And because of that, you want to have one owner. And because of that, you should have also on the IT side, probably one person or one component being responsible for that. And if you want to hold that component responsible for something, it needs to control certain aspects, like the sequence of things, for example, or the SLA. What happens if the logistic provider doesn't talk back to me within 2 hours? Is that okay or not? And deciding all these kind of factors, that's an architecture decision. And that's, to make a very long answer short, it depends on how you want to lay out the system. And in most bigger systems, I see a coexistence of both event-driven and orchestration.
Where do you see, ideally speaking, event-driven should predominate in your architectural choice?
every time when the component that triggers something is not really responsible for doing it. I give you one example. I like examples. I find that much easier to understand. And it's actually one thing I discussed with Sam Newman regularly. He wrote these microservices books. And he has an example also of an account opening in his book. And I have an account opening in my book. So that's a good collision of examples. And basically what I look at from an orchestration perspective is the customer applies to the bank account, for example, is opened. Because that's a responsibility of like one component, one microservice, if you will, or however you want to implement that. And that should be orchestrated. He looks at, okay, the customer needs to be put into the loyalty points bank. He needs an account there. He probably needs a whatever letter and certain things that are not in the responsibility of that core opening process. And then events are great because then you could just push an event on the bus saying, hey, the customer is created. And then you could build different components reacting to that, saying, okay, then we do this. But if we don't do that, nothing happens. The bank account is still opened. Your COO will not come to you basically asking you, why is it not on the loyalty points bank? It's a different responsibility. And this kind of trade-off, I think, is very important to think about.
So if I could summarize what you said in sort of a sentence or two and tell me when I've got it right about, it's basically from a business perspective where the responsibility lies.
Yeah. Interesting side note here. While this is one of the things I think on a conference level I discussed the most over the last years, it's still, when I look into our customer base, it's not the predominant problem. It might be discussed, but the predominant problem is that they have an integration spaghetti there where systems are talking to each other in a totally uncontrolled manner. And you have no way of really extracting the end-to-end business process. It's already hard to understand it, which makes it almost impossible to adjust it. And that's a big, big problem at the moment because there is so much change. You might want to drive customer experience. You might want to add new services. You might want to infuse AI everywhere, and they have mostly no idea how the process is currently running and they can't touch it. And I think that's the much bigger problem at the moment, to be honest.
Yes. Well, it's also a big problem from the public's point of view because they don't understand how fragile these software systems actually are. I don't know if you're familiar, for example, in the United States, there was this, the security vendor for some Microsoft systems had a bug. And this caused tremendous outages in the airlines, and especially Delta took days to recover. And there's all kinds of finger pointing going back and forth. But the public really doesn't understand how hodgepodge or fragile these software systems are. And you seem to, when you talk about this from the IT perspective, I don't think upper management sometimes realizes how fragile these systems are. Do you have any feeling about this one way or the other? How to explain this to people, whether upper management or the public?
But I think that's honestly one of the, let's say, core areas where we also look at when we talk about business processes and process orchestration, because it's exactly that connection between business and IT. Like the IT side is implementing the process, okay, but the business side needs to understand the end-to-end process. And if I talk to the business, they have different language. They talk about whatever business model canvas, customer journeys, value streams, and these kind of things. We can get also the business to level where we talk about an end-to-end business process and probably business capabilities. And then we want to link that to implementation. And the process for me is one of the key elements to do that, because that's also what a business person understands. And then as soon as you have that running, you can even link data to that. Yeah.
You hit on one of what I think is a key role of an architect, because the architect is the person who can talk to the business people about business and the technical people about technology. They're the sort of the interpreter of the two different worlds.
Yeah. 100%. When you ask about architect, what always comes to my mind first is I think there are still different levels to an architect. So I started, I would say, as a solution architect, looking at a single solution only, which is a bit different to looking on an enterprise architecture or even a business architecture level. But I totally agree, especially the latter two should be able to, I like the Gregor Hoppe's metaphor actually of the architect elevator, that you have to ride the elevator up and down from the engine to the penthouse, and you have to be able to talk to all of them.
Which means that one of the skills of an architect is, even if because of their generalization they lose some of their technical chops, they still have to keep their intuition about what is technically right and wrong.
I agree. And I'm still a big fan. I mean, I also do a lot of discussions nowadays about business value, for example, expressing business value. And I understand why it's so important to do that right. At the same time, I try to program, probably not on a daily basis anymore, but at least a weekly basis. I need to touch code very regularly to exactly keep that feeling what you're talking about. So yes, 100%.
Yes. Good. So you mentioned about processes in the enterprise, and you wanted to get back to that. Is there anything that, that comes to mind when you think about that?
I think I touched on that briefly. So what we're currently seeing is a lot of change in organizations. That's probably not news. AI or agentic AI or whatever the buzzword of the day is, puts a lot of pressure. And we see organizations struggle with that. And what we also see them doing, if you look at it from an enterprise perspective, very often they try to optimize things in local areas, like in that one application, or I use an whatever robotic process automation bot over here. I want to use that AI tool over here. But very often that's local, because that's how the teams are siloed in that organization, very often the business teams. And then they start to do projects which on a local level might make sense because they have an ROI. Oh, we automated that. We saved manual labor. There's an ROI. But looking like zooming out, and that's what a lot of companies miss, zooming out, looking at these end-to-end process again. It doesn't have to be necessarily good what they're doing. Either it doesn't have any influence on the overall end-to-end process. It can even cement certain bad behaviors, bad patterns, like making it harder to change that overall process. And it definitely not looks at like improving it end-to-end. There are tons of examples. So we have seen, for example, AI to do support requests. You could save if you make the overall application process much smoother, for example. And then, of course, you should invest like there and not like making the support better, even if that looks good on an isolated basis. And all these kind of local optimizations, I think, are a huge problem. So we need to elevate that discussion to understand that value stream and the business process. And for me, process orchestration is kind of the key element to make that happen, because it can actually look at the process and make the connection to really executable software and then orchestrate different pieces, different tasks together. And that's super powerful if you look at that on an enterprise level. So not so much in my local project, how can I orchestrate the process better? We have that as well, but really look at it more holistically. And that's what we're currently doing with quite a couple of customers, which is super interesting.
I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but this is actually a broad economic phenomenon. I don't know if you're familiar with something called Pareto optimization, but the argument there is very much the one that you mentioned, is that if you want to optimize something and you can't do local optimizations, you generally have to re-optimize the whole system to get an incremental optimization. And, what you're describing actually fits into a larger economic, and you seem to say that process orchestration is a way of forcing that issue to the front.
Yeah, and it's a way of probably solving the riddle, at least to some extent. I mean, it's not the only piece, but I think it's a centerpiece. And it's something, again, which you can make a CIO or CEO or COO understand, because business process is not
foreign language.
For example, I think that's one problem of the microservices community, for example. It's discussed in IT only. If I go to a business process, business capability level, I can talk to business as well. And that's a different thing, because you need them. I mean, that's actually why the business exists. So you need them. And that's saying me as kind of an engineer by heart. You need them, of course, on board to make transformation happen.
I think in my career, I've had the same experience, that it's amazing how many of the technology people think in terms only of technology and don't understand the business reason for doing something. After all, it's the business that's paying. It's the business that's driven. I mean, yeah, I'm fascinated with technology too, but the idea is in service of a goal.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think I thought about that quite a bit as well, because for me, it was kind of a transformation, a journey, I would say personally, because I was super nerdy and enthusiastic about technology for a long time.
It's fun. Technology is fun.
It is. And I loved it. I mean, we did a process orchestration engine that can scale on geographically distributed data centers and without adding latency, but we still have the same throughput, for example. So that's obviously awesome and exciting.
But you tell that to a business person and they go, duh.
Yeah, it's like,
duh. Right.
Geo redundancy, they might understand, but not how you did it.
Right.
But I still had that progression, I would say, to understand why business value is so important. And then also starting to understand how you can explain that better. Because very often it's an indirect story you have to tell why this technology enables this, what it can do in a software application, and that will basically increase whatever customer experience. And then you can talk to them. And that's so important. And probably I would say it's a typical journey a lot of people run through. And I think it's probably a good thing. I want to keep all those enthusiastic 20 years old people that love technology. They are awesome and we need them.
And maybe some of them will stay that way for 40 years.
Yeah, it's also fine. Yeah, true.
I think, it's a mistake to think that everybody has to become an architect, or to be a super developer is great too.
It is. And for me, for example, I did a very conscious decision not to go into people management. And for me, that architect, for example, is also a path you could take where you say, I don't want to people manage, but I want to get to a broader view and have kind of whatever, probably making bigger decisions, if you will.
That must be tough running a company.
You have to find the right co-founder. Again, a piece of luck I had in my life. So,
but also it's important to explain that story to the technology people, why they can't fall in love with this piece of technology. And they have to do it maybe the old-fashioned way because that's better for the business.
Yeah. It's not always easy. Yeah? You probably know that there's a blog post called Choose Boring Technology or something like that. And that's what it's very often about.
Yes. So 2 questions that sort of come to mind, and they're separate questions, but I think they're things that you've touched on that are important. How do you train developers? If developers have trouble understanding when to use events, when, and choreograph, and when to orchestrate, and distributed systems and asynchronous systems, how do you train new developers to understand this?
There is, as always, nuance to that. So there are things where I just think people have to be made aware just by trying things out. And that's, I would say, for the smaller problems, like, for example, mastering asynchronous communication, having probably consistency problem, like transactional problems, long-running things. Those you can occasionally train by doing examples, probably let them writing things and probably review stuff. So that.
And wonder why their system's hanging.
Yeah. I think I even personally learned trouble of two-phase commit early on in my life in a real life scenario. I mean, that's something that sticks with you afterward. So that's okay. I would say the bit more architectural questions, the bigger, hairy ones like event-driven or orchestration, which might influence not only like one communication link, but probably how you lay out the whole architecture. That's probably not for a newbie. That's probably something where it's good to have some experienced people on board. We very often do coachings, but when I talk to people, it's very often architects that already have seen something. Otherwise, it might be hairy.
So sort of what you're saying is that gradual exposure to increasingly more complex situations is basically the way people learn.
Yeah, probably. I would say so.
And the other thing you talked about is sort of your love, if that's too strong a word, but your appreciation of visual communication and visual tools.
Oh, I would say love is a good word.
Okay. I think given that people very often don't appreciate this, and I know from the work that I've done with workflow and the little work that I've done with process orchestration, visuals are very, very important, especially with long-running processes that you can't necessarily get in your head completely.
Yeah. It's even a problem that you can express very well with visuals. Like it's a flow of activities, probably some different path. Then there are events happening where you go somewhere else. So it's a problem that fits well on a visual. And to be honest, I don't get it why people are so against it. And every time when I discuss a process with people, even they that don't like visuals, what they do first is take a whiteboard and draw it.
Yes.
It's like, because otherwise you can't follow. So I personally don't get it. And then sometimes get arguments like, but how can I do diffing? Yeah, you can do visual diffing. I'm not sure if that's the most important question, but you could do it. So no, I just don't get it.
There's a limit to the amount of complexity the human mind can conceive of. And they're not linear processes necessarily. So, and there's feedback. It seems almost perfect for a diagram.
Yeah, I agree. And same thing, probably you need different levels of abstractions. For example, you can do sub-processes or certain things that might happen you might want to handle in a different process, or some things you might still want to handle in code. So you can play with that. It's one tool in your tool belt. And if it fits, it simply should be used.
Yes. So one of the things I like to do to ask all the architects that appear on the podcast is the architect's questionnaire, which sort of gets into sort of the more human side of being an architect. So what's your favorite part of being an architect?
Yeah, I think I said that relatively in the beginning, like seeing the big picture, like not going super deep in one element, but understanding like the different pieces and how they are connected, probably also how they're connected to business strategy, how they're connected to the technical implementation. So I think that's my favorite part, I would say.
So what is your least favorite part of being an architect?
To some extent, that's probably also connected to my current role, which means I'm very often talking to a lot of companies, but always as an external. And I think that's also true for architects in organizations. So you're not part of the team typically. You're very often an outsider, which I can live with, but it's probably my least favorite thing of it. Yeah.
Is there anything creatively, spiritually, or emotionally about architecture or being an architect?
I love that question, but the creativity part, I think it's clear. I think it's super creative. You have to very often find elegant solutions for very complex problems and make them or communicate them in a way that they're easy to understand. That's very creative. And I love doing that. It always makes you a little bit happy if you see that this seems to be understood and works. And the spiritual or emotional element, it's probably harder to answer. But for me, it's, again, I would say happy is kind of the thing. If you see that it's working out, if you see that people understand it, if you see that whatever you draw helps people understand things or implement that, it's just a good feeling.
The world is a little better off incrementally. What turns you off about architecture or being an architect?
I would say there's a typical perception around architects also being kind of the naysayers, the no-sayers, the governance entity, the police, if you will, which I think is not true, at least not for good architects at all. But it's kind of the one thing I very often hear.
Do you have any favorite technologies?
Oh, that's easy. That's of course BPMN. It's of course Camunda. I contributed to a couple of other workflow engines in the past as well. So there's great technology. Otherwise, I would say simply also programming. So I'm a Java person. I started with Java and I like Java. I like the type languages, to be honest. I like the dependency management. I like the tooling, the ecosystems, the open source around it. So, yeah. What
about architecture do you love?
Probably repetition, but I would say like breaking things down into manageable pieces, solving a complex problem. And I would say that's more or less it.
And what about architecture do you hate?
Discussions. Too long discussions, too many discussions, not fruitful discussions. I know it's part of the thing, and to some extent I like it and makes things better, but at some point in time it's too much.
What profession other than being an architect would you like to attempt?
I haven't found any so far. Co-founding the company, I had a couple of roles in the past, but it always was architecture related, to be honest. I think my absolute favorite was kind of what we now call a solution engineer, doing proof of concepts, like flying into the customer 3 days, get something to work in their environment and leave. You don't have to finish it, but you can draw the boxes to sketch the idea and prove that it really works. So that was always my favorite.
Do you ever see yourself as not being an architect anymore?
Probably. Let's see. What I said early on, what I experience at the moment is that I had that phase of my life that I would say 10 years where I was so enthusiastic about technology. When I was at a conference, I picked up something, some keyword. I had to Google that. I could try it out. I was sitting in the evening in the hotel room hacking something to understand it. To some extent, that changed a little bit, probably also with family and kids and whatever, not so much time. And I seeing that generation is still there doing that, probably now with AI and stuff. So I kind of foresee to probably do more mentoring than architecture actively myself, but not yet.
And when a project is done, what do you like to hear from the clients or your team?
When I read the question, my first thought was, it's not really an answer, but my first thought was, don't make any more projects, go into the product thinking world. That's where you should be, actually. So a project is never done. If you do software, it should be kind of a product, should be maintained, should be a life cycle, you should keep doing things. So that's one thing, but I totally get the question. So the other thing, and that's probably, again, because of my time in my life, I would like to hear from them, what's the value of what we just did? What's the story that connects it to the business value? What could we tell everybody in the company why we did what we just did and why is this great? I think if they achieve that, for me, that would be even better than, quote unquote, just having a great technical solution.
Well, thank you very much. I found this conversation fascinating, and I think you've illuminated many dark corners for people about both orchestration and how to think about architecture. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Michael.